Someone calls your name across a crowded room, and before you've even registered the sound as speech, your head is already turning. That reaction happens in under 200 milliseconds, faster than you can decide to respond, faster than you can think. Your brain has learned to treat those specific syllables as more urgent than almost any other sound in your environment, more urgent than a car horn, sometimes more urgent than your own thoughts. You've probably never questioned why. The name feels like it was always yours, something stitched into you at birth, as fixed as your fingerprints. But for most of the roughly 300,000 years modern humans have existed, a name wasn't a fixed possession at all. It wasn't unique. It wasn't permanent. In many societies, it wasn't even really yours. It belonged to your ancestors, and you were just borrowing it for a while. By the end of this video, you'll understand that the thing you think is the most personal fact about you, your name, is actually one of the oldest pieces of social technology humans ever built. And once you see what it was built to do, you'll never hear your own name the same way again. Start in the Kalahari Desert, in a region straddling Botswana and Namibia, with a people called the Jew hoansi. In the 1960s, a Canadian anthropologist named Richard Lee began a series of long-term field studies among the Jew/hoansi, then still widely known outside their own community as the Kung San. Lee spent years living alongside groups of foragers in the Dobe area, documenting a society that had persisted largely outside agriculture and outside the state. One of the strangest things he documented had nothing to do with hunting or gathering. It was naming. The Zhu Huanzi draw, personal names from a surprisingly small shared pool, passed down through families, cycling from grandparent to grandchild, generation after generation. A newborn isn't given a new original name invented for them. They're given the name of a specific relative, and from that moment on, they inherit a web of social obligations that come attached to that name. Someone who shares your father's name, for instance, may be treated socially as a kind of father, regardless of blood. Your name in this system isn't a marker of your individuality. It's the opposite. It's a slot in a lineage. You are, in a very real sense, wearing someone else's identity forward in time. That should already complicate the idea that a name is supposed to express who you uniquely are. But here's where it gets stranger, because when humans finally did start writing names down, they weren't trying to capture identity either. They were trying to solve a completely different problem. Travel to the city of Uruk in what's now southern Iraq, somewhere between 3,400 and 3,200 BCE. Archaeologists working through the temple archives of ancient Sumer uncovered a small clay tablet, roughly 3 inches across, pressed with wedge-shaped cuneiform signs. It records a transaction, 29,086 measures of barley, received over a period of 37 months. At the bottom, 2 symbols, pronounced Ku and Shiem, spell out a name, Kushim. Historians now regard this as the earliest known instance of a personal name preserved in writing anywhere on Earth. Not a king, not a general, not a god. A temple administrator responsible for tracking grain, whose name survived 5,000 years because he was accountable for barley. Kushim's name appears on at least 17 other tablets from the same period, several of them tied to the title Sangha, a kind of senior temple official. Whether Kushim referred to one specific man or was a title passed between office holders is still debated by scholars. But the function is clear either way. This name wasn't written down to honor a person. It was written down to assign responsibility. If the barley went missing, someone needed to be named. Writing, in other words, didn't invent names to celebrate the self. It invented written names to create the first system of accountability in human history. Your name's oldest job wasn't to say who you are. It was to say who's to blame. That's not the whole story, though, because a name that exists to track a debt is a very different kind of object from a name that exists to track a person across an entire lifetime. And the next shift in how humans used names didn't come from temples or grain stores. It came from something far more personal: the Roman obsession with legal status, inheritance, and public reputation. In ancient Rome, a citizen's name wasn't a private label. It was a legal document. By the height of the Republic, a freeborn Roman man typically carried 3 names: the tria nomina, A praenomen, a personal first name chosen from a strikingly small approved list, maybe 18 in common use. A nomen marking which of the major clans or gentes he belonged to. And a cognomen, a third name that often started as a nickname and hardened into a hereditary branch identifier. Take Gaius Julius Caesar. Gaius was his personal name, one of a handful available to him. Julius announced he belonged to the gens Julia. Caesar distinguished his specific family line within that clan, and according to some ancient sources may have originally referred to an ancestor with a full head of hair or one born by surgical delivery. Historians still dispute the origin. The point is that a Roman name wasn't primarily about you. It was a compressed legal record of your lineage, your citizenship, your legitimacy in the eyes of the state. Slaves, by contrast, typically held only a single name, often assigned by their owner, a linguistic marker of the fact that Roman law didn't recognize them as full legal persons. In Rome, how many names you were allowed to have was a direct measurement of how much the state considered you to be somebody. That system collapsed along with the Western Empire. But the underlying problem, how do you track who belongs to whom and who owes what to the state, didn't go away. It just resurfaced 8 centuries later in England in an entirely different form. By the 14th century, England had a naming crisis. Not because people had too many names, because they had almost none. A poll tax survey from Yorkshire in 1379 shows just how narrow the pool had become. Roughly half of all men recorded carried only 2 first names between them, John or William. Multiply that across a growing, increasingly mobile population, and the state had a serious identification problem. 2 men named John living in the same village were, administratively, almost indistinguishable. The fix was the same one Rome had already stumbled onto. Attach a second descriptive tag. Thomas the baker, Richard at the wood, John, son of Adam, shortened over time to Adamson or Atkinson. By the time of Richard II's poll tax records in 1381, most English families had begun locking these descriptive tags into place, passing them down rather than reinventing them each generation. In 1413, the Statute of Additions went further, legally requiring official documents to record not just a person's name, but their occupation and place of residence alongside it. Surnames, in other words, weren't born from a desire for self-expression. They were a direct response to a bureaucratic bottleneck, the same bottleneck Sumerian scribes had hit with Kushim nearly 5,000 years earlier. Every time a naming system became too small to keep individuals administratively distinct, a government or an institution stepped in and expanded it. Except there was a problem nobody anticipated. Once a name stopped being just a bureaucratic tag and became something you carried your entire life, inherited from your father, passed to your children, it started to feel like it belonged to you in a completely different way. Personally, emotionally, almost physically. And in 1985, a Belgian psychologist accidentally proved just how deep that feeling runs. Joseph Newton, working out of the University of Leuven, had noticed something odd about himself years earlier. He preferred car license plates that happened to contain the letters of his own name. Participants were shown pairs of letters and asked, with no explanation of the study's purpose, simply to pick which letter they found more attractive. The result? People reliably rated the letters in their own first and last names as more attractive than other letters, even when Newton controlled for how common, how visually simple, or how pleasant sounding those letters were. The effect held up regardless of whether people noticed the connection to their own name at all. It's since been replicated across more than a dozen languages and multiple alphabets. Psychologists now call this the name letter effect, and they treat it as one of the clearest windows into what's called implicit self-esteem, a layer of self-regard that operates completely below conscious awareness. You don't choose to like the letters in your name more. You just do. Somewhere beneath deliberate thought, your brain has quietly fused your sense of self to a handful of arbitrary written symbols, which is the strange loop this whole history closes on. A name started as a slot in a kinship system, recycled from the dead among the Jew/hoansi. It became a bureaucratic signature invented so a Sumerian temple could track missing barley. It became a legal marker of citizenship in Rome, then a tax collection tool in medieval England. At no point in 5,000 years of recorded history was a name designed to capture your unique inner self. It was designed to make you legible to other people, countable, taxable, distinguishable from your neighbor. And yet here you are feeling a small, involuntary pull toward the very letters that spell it out. The system built to track you from the outside is the same system your brain has quietly mistaken for the truth of who you are on the inside.